Dr. Power, the guests have arrived.
Thanks very much, Chauncey. Hi, folks. Come on in. Jennifer, the chair for you there, and Adam, a chair for you over here. Dave, good to see you again. It's interesting. I was informed from some good authorities that you Vic students at the fraternity up here, I think there's only one, at Delta Kappa Epsilon, the Deeks they call themselves, and a marvelous fraternity. I think it's, I say, the only one on campus. Has got quite a pedigree. And my grandson Matthew's there, but believe it or not, last Friday they were sitting and enjoying what's in the news and having a bit of a conversation. So to you folks, come in, have a seat, and you're welcome to join the Masters of Executive MBA program here at Royal Roads. Good to see you. Today, what I want to talk about, just some interesting points. First, some administrative things. This week, we're moving off into Unit 6, strategic leadership, corporate governance, ethics, those sort of soft parts of it, but it's that period of migration, if you would. You recall we talked at the front in a strategist perspective about substantially a lot of weight in strategic management is the science, the sense that we do modeling and interpretations of models and draw some conclusions from that. And then partway through, after crafting the strategy, we move into implementing the strategy. And with that transformational shift from crafting to implementation, greater weight is placed on strategic leadership. And so this session, we start focusing a little bit more on the strategic leadership, on the art, if you would, of putting your strategic plan into place. And so some interesting things we'll have a chance to talk about as we go through it. And to that end, right after this, I'm making another 30-40 minute YouTube video with a wonderful woman coming in who is a CEO, set up her own organization from scratch, not for profit. But she's finished a rather substantial paper on strategic leadership and some of the models and some of her findings within her particular sector that I thought would be helpful to share for you folks not for profit, and as well as just some general strategic leadership concept for all of us as we go through it. So I'll let you know when that's posted and up on the site, but we're pleased to have her just after this session here today. What else is on my little mind? Royal Roads goes global. You've finished that short little context case. And the important thing here is you just can't do strategy in isolation. You need other disciplines such as international business. In international business, we've learned there briefly that your 6 modes of entry are ranging with different degrees of risk. The idea of first we start sort of with exporting and licensing and moving on into joint ventures and franchising, wholly owned subsidiaries, greenfields, etc. And every time you do that, there's greater risk, greater exposure for you in your offshore enterprise. And so we did some of that last week when we looked at some of the considerations of taking this particular university a number of years ago when it contemplated going into some other country, some of the considerations you'd have to go through as an entrepreneur in taking your business offshore. And you've got my feedback on that, my sense of what the answers might consider. And no wrong right answers in this class, but have a look at those along with what you've discussed with your colleagues, and hope you've moved a little farther down the road on that. This week we do your individual case study analysis. It's in your texts. I think it's case number 11, Cirrus. And I've taken the liberty of giving you some questions to speed up the process. On the final exam, you'll get a case out of the text just like that, but you won't get the questions. You'll have to come up with what you think the questions are. And I'll give you 5 questions on the final exam worth different degrees of marks. And you can go from there. I've got 90 minutes to give me the answer for that particular portion of the final exam. But we do the individual assignments. With respect to your papers, it's been a busy week for me with the short week, convocation, chewed up a chunk of it, and so I've been scrambling to catch up. So you'll not have your papers, as you know by now, on last Friday, but I'll try to have them to you by Tuesday of this week, complete, to give you a sense of feedback and moving ahead. I've also arranged with the IT folks here in Unit 6, it's not there yet, or it should be just about now, a site that for those that want to, it's not mandatory, but there's such good intellectual capital from your papers on assignment number 2 about the Internet of Everything, and then there's different business sectors and how they're going to be impacted and how to design strategies to deal with that and the dark side of the Internet in data security, data privacy, data sovereignty, data censorship, those sort of issues in your particular business sectors. And so I'm going to ask you all, when that site appears, volunteer if you wouldn't mind sharing your papers, because I've had the pleasure of reading them. I think your colleagues might be interested, coming from other business and other sectors, to see some of the considerations and some of the exciting things that are happening in your field in this new Internet of Everything, this new industrial age that we're going into. Okay, underway today. Saudi, interesting thing. Just some brief points before I start the paper. Recall last week we talked about Saudi Arabia and this new initiative by this young man who's the heir apparent to take over Saudi, and this transformational shift of taking Saudi from a looking in the rearview mirror sort of nation into the forward state of a modern nation, and the challenges and the segregating out the folks that are likely to give him a bit of a heartburn, holding them off in hotels while he gets this in place. But he's going to try to implement a real regime reset, if you would, over there for how Saudi deals with women and human rights and its neighbors and Israel, etc. There's all sorts of exciting things percolating around there. But to fund this, we said 5% of the national oil company is up for grabs, up for sale. And we said China is sniffing around to take 5%. And that gives them some moral suasion, some interest, some control, some soft power in Saudi. And it occurred to me as I was sitting thinking about that, you recall we talked about the 6 domains of war, which one is the economic war. And right now there's an economic war going on, this tension between the hegemony, if you would, of the American dollar, the U.S. currency, being the vehicle currency of the globe, particularly in the light of the EU having some difficulties we talked about last week. The euro is weaker because of it. And so the U.S. dollar, greenback, stands strong and tall. But increasingly, it's under attack, and the Chinese are the attackers in large part. About 2 years ago, they get into the IMF basket as a recognized reserve currency, which is a quantum move for them to be recognized as a world vehicle currency. But can you imagine for a moment if they were to make it a condition of giving the money to Saudi for 5% of the oil company, that the price of Saudi oil would no longer be valued in U.S. dollars? That is earth-shattering. Maybe a little background here might help. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, when just after the war was coming to an end, the winning nations got together in the States in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire area, and they settled on the rules of monopoly, if you would, going forward. The world organizations, the World Bank, IMF, etc., and they had a chance to shape the rules of the game the way they wanted it. They were able to put in place conditions like the president would always be here, the vice president would always be here, and primarily America got a lot of control over these world organizations, which is causing heartburn today, and like the Asian equivalent to the IMF they've set up, etc., over there. But just pushing on from that, and part of that condition, they came out and said, get rid of your gold, you won't need it anymore, but I want you, all the countries of the world from now on, moving forward, to deal with the U.S. dollar as the underwriting value. It's just a promise to pay, it's an IOU, but accept that instead of gold. And the currency said, yes, we will do that. And the U.S. said, what we will do is we will back each piece of paper we issue with an equivalent amount of gold, $32 an ounce, one piece of paper, $32 for one piece of paper. And so they went along pretty well until the Vietnam War happened, and they're down in the basement printing money to pay for the war, and it was getting out of control. They didn't have enough gold to back all the paper they're printing. And so Nixon, I think I remember Friday night I watched the television that Nixon came out, I think it was 1971, and said that effective Monday morning, there's no gold standard. We're getting off the gold standard. Just believe, have faith, trust that the U.S. dollar is worth $1, and we'll go from there. Well, there's lots of rumblings, lots of tension, lots of worries over that weekend as to what was going to happen if it wasn't backed by gold. And part of the settlement would be that nations were allowed to have a fixed and floating currencies. And the fixed currency was one where they would say, the Mexicans, for example, took the peso and said there'd be 8 pesos to an American dollar. No matter what happens to the American dollar, strong or weak, there'd be 8 pesos going up and down. The Canadians took the floating model, saying the demand-supply curve, depending what the demand is today, we'll incrementally go up half a cent, down a cent, as we've been doing. In fact, since the start of this course, we've ranged somewhere between 81 cents and 78 cents. It's been fluctuating like this. In the fixed model, that doesn't happen. It just stays, and like a dam, it builds. And so we see in Mexico and Britain and other places, certainly Mexico, when they had that fixed currency and it let go, they dropped 20% overnight. And that was a disaster for Mexico. They were a basket case. Clinton had to bail them out. But can you imagine having a mortgage, for example, as many clients, folks I dealt with down in Cabo San Lucas, the hotels down there, had all their mortgages in U.S. dollars. But if the peso drops by 20%, all of a sudden their payments have just jumped by 20%, and they were losing their hotels like mad because they couldn't keep up with the debt in the foreign currency. They didn't hedge future swaps, options, those sort of contracts we talk about in the course. And so anyway, that's what happened. And the vehicle currency today then is under attack. The part of the deal was in 1973, with Saudi came out and said, here's the deal to the States. It was Kissinger behind all this. Kissinger said, we'll keep you in power, to the royal family, to the Saudis, we'll keep you in power, but you do this for us. You'll always use the American dollar as the metric for selling your currency, and that guarantees us it will be the vehicle currency. And that's working up to recent date. And increasingly, we see countries like Russia, Venezuela, other Arab nations, Iraq, Iran, Libya, all those countries announced going off the dollar into some other currency, even the gold dinar. And the minute they made those announcements, Libya, Iraq, etc., attacks weren't shortly thereafter, and they were displaced. And so there's lots here swirling around we need to watch. But the demand-supply curve is weakening hourly for the U.S. dollar, less demand as the China gets a greater toehold in this area, and the bitcoins and other alternate currencies get in place. And so we want to watch for that, but it came to me that it's something we should be thinking about. There's a great in the bonus section, I have a show called Commanding Heights, 6 hours. Get your popcorn, only if you're really interested in this stuff, but you want some sense of how we got to where we are today economically, with the views of Hayek and Margaret Thatcher and Friedman and the Americans, Reagan model going through and how we got here. It's worth seeing this fight over who controls, is it Plato or Aristotle, who controls the state, and it's worthwhile watching. If not on the course, burn a copy, take it with you. Bill sent me some interesting things in my mobile office, this idea of the drone cars, automated cars coming in, and had a chance to look at the Mercedes. It's beautiful. In fact, I took a few more seconds. It really screwed me up that morning. I think I spent over 20 minutes I could ill afford scouring through the site that he sent me. But it occurred to me that probably we'll never own these cars that are coming out in the next few years, some as early as 2021. We'll never own them. And the insurance is primarily the reason that's going to happen, that if you're not driving, you're just a passenger in the bus going along and there's an accident, it's not fair that they somehow claim you are going to have to pay the insurance if there's an accident. It's going to have to be controlled by national chains like Uber and Ford and other folks. And so increasingly, I think it's going to be like your Shaw cable with different grades of budget-priced or premium-priced services. If you want the Mercedes service, the premium grade, you pay X number of dollars a month. If you want the budget price model, you pay X number of dollars a month. But unlikely we'll ever own our own unit on this thing. In California, New York have passed legislation, by the way, stating just that the insurance would pay the people liable for it, will be the Ubers of the world, would be responsible for the car insurance. So that was interesting. Last week we talked about the merger of Time Warner. And I looked at that for a few minutes, and I just thought it related back to strategy, that we've talked in terms of the Boston matrix, the importance of doing a portfolio analysis where you take your stars, your dogs, your cash cows, your question marks, and plug them in, do an analysis of how important they are to you based on whatever your criteria happen to be for your organizations. And here we have a situation that CNN, on a Boston portfolio matrix to the current Time Warner group that are running it, have been told to divest it, and the number of viewers, the advertising revenues, etc., for CNN's hemorrhaging because of their political positions on television. And as it hemorrhages, if they have to divest that, we talked about the Trump administration, Attorney General's branch are pushing to allow this merger and acquisition to go through, to get rid of the Time Warner, or get rid of the CNN. It occurred to me for a minute, and the message here is for us as strategists, sometimes those units that are your dogs, you say, I'm going to divest, I'm going to prune the rose bush and get rid of this and get rid of this and get rid of this. Keep in mind what you're throwing away may be the missing piece of the puzzle to your competition. So think carefully before you throw that particular piece away. Now, if they were to throw that away, just imagine for a moment, there's a guy called Steve Bannon who was Trump's strategy senior advisor, left and is very vocal and very strident and gathering forces as we speak to go from each battleground, each state, each battleground, and push for a Republican candidate that aligns with his views, which are largely replicated by Trump, his views, and not the Republican establishment, they refer to it down there, of the old guard. And but one of the things he promised us to do, he was the ex-CEO of Breitbart News, which is coming up like mad as a news source. he promised that he was going to start another news service, television service, bigger than some of these other ones, and he mentioned some backers he had. So imagine for a moment if he was to step in with some backers and buy CNN. Interesting outcomes would happen. Certainly the bums in the current seats, as our friend says, the right bums on the bus, wrong bums off the bus, and the right bums in the right seats. I suspect Wolf and a bunch of those folks there are going to be for the high jump if Bannon was to take over CNN with the backing of some folks. So to watch for that, it was interesting, but certainly Trump's issues and challenges with CNN and fake news may soon be at an end. Hayden, excellent post. We talked in terms of Brexit and leaving over there and Prime Minister May and one thing and another, and we chatted. But I thought I'd just share with you there that in the last referendum they had from all sources, they spent $330 million, and George Soros has just set up a fund to fund these sort of organizations that support his view of how the world should be, to include the anti-Brexit folks in Britain, Black Lives Matter, etc. He's put this 18 billion, not 330 million, but 18 billion in funding available to fund these sort of associate sites and get them up and get them moving. And so I guess my message would be that May seems to be weakening. I'm not sure she's the right person at this particular moment in time for Britain. She's showing some weakness and confusion over there as to whether they're going to proceed or not going to proceed, and the challenges for that. And so we're going to watch that because it has a big impact on us, whether Britain goes forward, doesn't go forward, big impact on the European Union, whether it goes forward, doesn't go forward. We see other little percolations of right-wing groups percolating in France and Austria, completely right-wing now. These things are happening. But also part of that, it occurred to me, and chatting here a little bit more, is that the role of the British military, it's always been able to punch above its weight. It's been a stalwart ally for America and for the rest. It's always first up and antes up, and with sufficient number of troops to be a real weight in the situation. But the EU is moving ahead with its own EU military force, of which Britain has committed itself to supply troops, as has Germany and a bunch of others has committed to supply troops. And the idea is that it'll all come under command of Brussels. And part of the condition is no longer will Britain and others go off in frolics of their own, say, on national security interests, I want to go attack the Falklands. It's all going to be controlled by Brussels. And that opens up some challenges, doesn't it? It seems to me that it's going to weaken the allies that are led by the American administration. EU doesn't always align its view, its vision, on how we should be dealing with certain things. So you may not have that strong support of Britain, and more difficult to put a consortium of folks together to go into countries like the Middle East and things they've done as a result of this. Worth watching for. Okay, that's that. Let's reel with the paper we can, very briefly. Canada's going to challenge the software tariffs, all part of this NAFTA negotiations. As you know, they're not going nicely. It's getting increasingly tense, more hardball being played by the parties. Canada, to its credit, seems to be standing up and aligns with our Mexican colleague to the south of the Three Amigos, and standing up to Trump and his view. Ottawa particularly wants to keep Chapter 19, which provides for a dispute resolution system under NAFTA, that we can go and take it there and have it adjudicated. And almost every occasion, that particular arbitration process is found in Canada's favor, particularly on the softwood tariffs. The World Trade Organization and other things possibly, but Trump wants to get rid of this arbitration panel and say, no, just stick it completely into the NAFTA. So watch for that. It's fighting right now. I'm reminded of the Wolfenproof song, thinking again about the Deeks. The idea of gentlemen, scholars, and jolly good fellows is the cry. Trudeau is committed to global peacekeeping missions. I'm not sure. This may be sort of as we had in the Arctic. Every year they take a photo op up there, take pictures, pledge all sorts of things for Canada's North. Nothing happens. But a year and a half or 2 years ago, he pledged $400 million and 600 soldiers it was a year ago, for peacekeeping missions. But they said they won't necessarily be soldiers, but there'll be other folks. So it may well be RCMP and police officers for those different skill sets than I think of a pair of boots and rifles would do, the old traditional peacekeepers that I'm familiar with. This was troubling. very troubling. It should be to all of us. Canada cast a net over the Northwest Passage. That's ours. There's 3 passages up there. The Russians have one. We have one, and there's one right over the Arctic that's not open yet. But they're sending the Snow Dragon, the largest icebreaker in the world. It's not nuclear, but it's the largest icebreaker in the world. And you raise the question, why in the hell would China even have the world's largest icebreaker? They're not an Arctic nation, but anyway, they have this largest icebreaker. And they want to send some scientists, and they call it an inspection net of our passage. They're going to be completely understanding the ups, the downs, and what makes it tick of our Northwest Passage. And Canada said, by all means, come on and do it. Can you imagine for a moment if China said, I think we want to do that to the Russian passage, or I think we want to go into the Gulf of Mexico and just do a surveillance and net to see what's in there, and to whatever extent. This idea of the, I mean, let's talk. I mean, it doesn't make sense for us to be allowing this, or in fact, can we even do anything about it? I mean, that's the other part of the story, is that we sit on the second largest landmass in the world, the second largest, 34 million people, 25% of the world's fresh water, rich, rare earths, all those things that Porter talks about in his factor endowments, basic factor endowments. We've got it in spades, 34 million people. We're not going to be able to defend that. And as the world runs out of water, which it is doing, and runs out of some of these rare earths, which it is doing, and food may or may not become a problem depending on distribution of it all, I guess Canada has 2 choices. We can stick our heads in the sand and just keep going down the straight road and do nothing until some time comes that China says, I need the Northwest Passage, it's not yours, what are you going to do about it? Or Americans say, you got some troubles in Quebec, we need to help you put that down because the protection of the St. Lawrence Seaway is vital to us to get the stuff into the heartland. What are you going to do about it? And we have little we can do. So maybe the answer for us, and reflect on this for a minute, should we be seeking a partner? We're going to be junior partner, we need a partner. Do we need to undertake a proper business case analysis of all the possible partners in the world to say what's in Canada's best interest? Now, I know we've got this alignment with the Americans, and we've got cousins, I've got cousins in Boston, and the natural tendency is to look to our neighbor to the south, but recognize we have neighbors to the north too. And do we even consider partnerships, a junior partner with Russia, junior partner with China, junior partner with Britain and the European Union, part of the Commonwealth group, that do we reactivate that and become part of that? But we're going to need a partner with some teeth to protect the second largest landmass in the world, or else it's going to be taken away from us. And this is just one example that causes me growing concern, that here's the Chinese, the second largest icebreaker, going through our passage. On occasion they've arrived in there and even unannounced, and we have nothing up there. We talk the talk, we have nothing up there, and I'm not sure we have the wherewithal to do much about it. But it's a super highway that's been opened up there for transportation. It says it's 20% saving rather than go through the Panama Canal for China. And they've also declared it's in their national security interest, so we can't stop them. They're coming through. So we should talk a bit about how important that is up there. Ontario is putting some tax relief in ahead of the election for next year, Liberal government in Ontario. And they want to, they're raising the minimum wage from $11.60 to $14 an hour, $11.60 to $14 an hour. And so we'll charge you that, but we're going to give you a point off your small business tax rate. And folks, this is just moving the chairs down the Titanic. You need something like Trump is doing down there, a complete reform. Get rid of this tax department of the size, make it simple, and just to adjust and say, we'll get you pay more for your expenses for your employees, but we'll give you a little bit of a break on your taxes here. That's just, as I say, just juggling the chairs in Titanic. But let's look at that if we can, see if you agree with that. This was disappointing to me, and I'm sure to all Canadians, that Montreal statue in Montreal was vandalized on Remembrance Day, sprayed red paint all over it. It was done by somebody called the Anti-Colonial Anti-Racist Group, and at the same time they called MacDonald a white supremacist, and also on Remembrance Day they went to a war memorial and also defaced that. And I'm sorry, that just bothers me. It's not part of our culture. It's in fact, we see it in the States. It was the other day, did you watch that? At a particular point in time in many locations around America, students like you, bright people normally, I would think, went outside at a fixed time and yelled at the sky for 2 minutes. And I watched, I just couldn't believe it. It's like well, my kids didn't have tantrums, but it's like kids having tantrums. They go out and they just yell and yell and yell, thinking they're going to get their way. Anyway, it's the same group that paints the statues red. Canada didn't sign on to the Asian Trade Pact. Trudeau, on that particular thing, stood up and said, no, thank you very much, we're not going to go with the TPP. Canada, the way it currently is put together, we lose primarily on tech and intellectual property and those things, and we need a better agreement. Much like Trump said a little while ago, and got raked over the coals for it. But Canada, to his credit, has stopped too, saying, this is not quite right, let's just renegotiate this whole thing. And of course, the Australians and others aren't speaking to him and think he pulled the pin out of the whole thing, so nothing's going ahead until they reconvene and think some more about this. Part of the whole thing in here, too, is that the human rights concerns, and Canada was waving his finger about human rights to some of these countries. And I should digress off there for a few minutes. I talk about the Bretton Woods Agreement. But at the same time, 1944, Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, was charged with the task for the UN being set up that would you come up with a set of human rights that we could look at and ratify and approve. And she in turn turned to a Canadian doctor in Ontario. And the Canadian doctor drew up the draft of human rights that the United Nations subsequently was to approve and make the standard. They were based on Anglo-Saxon Judeo-Christian values. And so the question we might just ask for a minute, when we come and wave our fingers in, let's say, China, as an upstart little country of a couple hundred years, and say, here are the human rights you have to follow. And China is quite a venerable Middle Kingdom, emerging 2,000 years worth of heritage and human rights. To say to them, these are the human rights you have to accept, they weren't at the table in 1944 to put their input into what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate. And so I'm not taking sides, but we should just understand for a few minutes what we did in 1944 and these same human rights and the IMF and the World Bank and these sort of standards are a little out of alignment today with these new emerging countries like China and India and other nations saying we didn't have an awful lot of input in that particular situation. India at that time was still part of the Commonwealth and very much involved with Britain. Big article in here about the importance of the drop in work-life balance. I won't go through it, but certainly it's something we all experience in a course like this, and the importance of, and indeed we talk about it every week, of maintaining some balance in your life and just not become overworked. And they talk in here about the percentage of folks that are overworked and the devices and this idea of we're all in these little handheld computers, and I said last week they're most connected, yet we're most disconnected because we're always on these computer systems. U.S. Congress is going to crack down on Chinese investment. While Canada opens the door, there are two divergent policies. China wants to come around and get some sense of technology and new innovations and work with Canadians and invest in Canada and migrate that information back to the home country. Canada seems to be prepared, since Harper's left under the new Liberal government, more receptive to that happening, more willing to see foreign direct investment come in here and to access intellectual property and that sort of information. The U.S. Congress has put the barrier up and said, no, hardening. We don't want China to come in and learn about our new chips and other technology, the breakthroughs that we're having. You're trying to hold it back. And so we have this two divergent views. What view do you think's right? Should we open up the doors for foreign direct investment and share our innermost thoughts with China, or should we remember at the end of the day that some things have to be left out? Is the American view closer to right? Again, on interesting property, intellectual property, again, it goes back to the view of the hand that the Anglo-Saxon, you and I, the way we tend to think on intellectual property is that the minute I invent something, it's mine, and I'm going to charge you a royalty to use it. Bill Gates, Microsoft, and so he just has the cash cow just raking it in because he's got a patent, the ability to control intellectual property. When you go to Canada's north, to the Indigenous people and to Asians and others, their view is, how can one man control an idea? The rivers, the wind, the sun, it belongs to all mankind. And so it's a little harder for them to fully understand by what authority, what power can these new civilizations in the West say intellectual property is something you can't use unless you pay me. The gap is closing. Certainly China is now getting very strong and starting to develop its own intellectual property. Indeed, there are occasions now that Americans go there and steal some of their stuff. So it's it's starting to do it, but just an interesting view of the hand. Man accused in Edmonton. You recall it was during the football game not too long ago. I forget the date. It was about a month ago. But the individual concerned, Abdul Hussein Sharif, took a car, slammed into a policeman, and then getting away, knocked down 4 more pedestrians. And he's now going before court. Said he seems like a normal guy, no bail application, but he's going in for psychiatric assessment to see for what reason he would do that. New blood pressure criteria, they've dropped it down to 130 over 90 from 140 over 90 for you folks out there with high blood pressure and take pills. Zimbabwe, shift over there was interesting. Mugabe, 93, decided recently to get rid of the succession plan he had in place for his organization. He wanted to appoint his wife. The military stepped in and put him under house arrest, and is just stabilizing things till they sort the place out. And that, I mean, if that comes to pass, that's a good role for the military. And if the military wants to take over, then they should get out of the military and put their hat in proper elections. But certainly with some regularity, Turkey and Egypt, military has often been there as the bastion for democracy, that when things go off the rails, the military step in for 6 months, hold it all together, put elections in place, and willing to step out and release control again. And if that was to happen, that's probably a good function for the military. The Lebanon Prime Minister, we talked about last week, said, no, I'm not being held captive. I am planning on going back to Lebanon. I'm just going to stay here a little longer. I don't know quite what that's all about, but we keep on watching it. Well, this was troubling too. They talk about culture shifting and the immigrants in the European Union, millions of them in there in France. And now the country's justice minister on Monday said that she was thinking that a 13-year-old could be reasonable age for sexual consent in France. And she went on to talk all about it. And I guess what drove it is that there's been some extremely shocking and unacceptable situations, a bunch of recent cases. One, for example, was a jury last week acquitted a 30-year-old man who was accused of raping an 11-year-old girl in 2009. And so increasingly we're having them look at this arbitrary age that maybe 13 is an appropriate age. Certainly the French are considering it. Certainly troubling as culture shifts. We could talk about that for a little bit. Liberals dropped their pledge to waive the GST on rental housing. We've had much talk about the price of housing in Toronto and Vancouver and Victoria, and the villain, in large part, is government. Tax. The GST on rental housing, the GST when you build, the tax, the transfer tax when you buy your property, thousands and tens of thousands of dollars every time you flip a home. The soft costs in there are just crazy, and plus the new regulations on just doing some remodeling, the environmental inspections and things that take place. Neighbor of mine is building, and I think they said there's been over $20,000 so far, just getting all the permits and things to build a very nice home. But $20,000 soft costs, well, the price of that home is going to be $20,000 more if they decide to sell it next year than it would have to be. So it's all about taxes, and we're just taxed too much. But we can look at that. PM urged to act on a jailed professor in Ottawa. Hussein Dabai, professor in France, extradited from Canada about 2008, claimed he was somehow involved in a 1980 bombing of a Paris synagogue. Evidence is sparse. He's been sitting in there just under house arrest and in detention for all this period of time, not well, children, and just can't get out of there. And so they're urging our Prime Minister to do something. He's a Canadian, entitled to Canadian rights, and we should be doing something to get our people out of there. Hasn't happened yet. But I got on a parallel section that we had these 3 basketball players for UCLA, you recall, last week. Videos actually caught them on tape stealing things. They call it shoplifting. Stealing things from not just one, but a number of stores. And yet those folks could be 10 years in prison, but President Xi listened to President Trump and was kind enough to put them on a plane and get them out of there, watching this last week, and send them home. Just a difference on the clout. And those folks probably deserve a little bit of time slap on the wrist as opposed to this gentleman that, given these years of being incarcerated, needs to be back home here and dealt with here and the proper rule of law. It's probably all about the terrorism aspect and the optics as opposed to any other thing. The government doesn't want to release them because they think they'd be soft on crime. But there's no evidence at this stage that puts them into that event. Well, let's see what else is on here. WestJet's coming up with a new little business model for another idea. They're trying to attack. Right now, they've only got 23% of the business class, and they want to go after that. So they're upgrading a small set of their things with new offerings of their jets to provide 9 lounges across Canada, upgrade the premium quality at plus service prices, just to try to take back some of the market share from Air Canada. And we've said before, that's one of the strategies we talked about last week, of going toe-to-toe. We want to do that if you've got deep pockets. If you don't have deep pockets, don't do that. As we find out between Amazon and Walmart right now are fighting it out toe-to-toe on groceries and online deliveries. And the only one that can catch up with Amazon clearly seems to be Walmart. All the rest in shopping malls, the future's not good for those folks. They need to come up with some activity centers for these malls, or they're just dead space. On the tracks, Ottawa deal, we've got a place, Churchill, I think it's underutilized on Hudson Bay, a great port, open most of the year that we can ship stuff out of. In fact, I often wonder why our gas doesn't go there off to Europe. But there's a train line that we sold to the American company, and we also gave them the rights to a substantial part of Churchill. We had a flood, and so as a result, the train tracks were knocked out. And part of the agreement was the company was supposed to fix the tracks and keep Churchill open. They're not going to do it because they said they're counting on Churchill for grain shipments, but under the NAFTA thing, they didn't ship grain there anymore. It's not viable to do it anymore. So there's a real dog's breakfast going on the Manitoba Railway that needs to be looked at. And that's all part of our infrastructure, those advanced factor endowments that Porter talks about. We need this intermodal transportation system working. Bombardier amazingly lands another C-Series deal. It seems just after Airbus takes over, the floodgates open, and it's signing deal after deal. And in fact, its problem is going to be is supply. I don't think it can supply all the things it's signing contracts for. Ottawa boasts its venture financing for female-led tech companies. And we've commented before that Trudeau, to his credit, half of the cabinet are females, and now they're upping another to $70 million on top of the $809 million they've already loaned to female-owned businesses, and just to support women in the workplace in starting their own little businesses. I did some consulting work for the BC Women's Entrepreneur Society, a fabulous group, great network for women in this province, but it's also in Alberta and places like that. For the females in the class, you may just want to look at the Women's Entrepreneur Societies in your area as a great way to network and get a leg up. Oh, this guy's crazy. Well, I take that back. He's not crazy. Stop. He's a colleague. Associate Professor, Alberta School of Business, was talking about Keystone contract and the importance of it, and it's going to do royalties for Alberta, and we should get out of the way and let them put the Keystone pipeline in place. And then in a short shrift, he goes on and says there are some risks to making a decades-long, multi-billion-dollar commitment to ship oil through these, but he says it seems rather muted. Well, I guess we have a different view of the hand, don't we? That, from my view, is the capital cost of putting in the Keystone pipelines are so large that the recovery of that capital cost and all the environmental infrastructure and things damaging, we're going so close right now to the alternative energy, to fission, nuclear fission coming down the pike, all these electrical energy things we're talking about for alternative energy. Surely if you took all that money you're going to put in the Keystone pipeline and put it into alternative energy, we'd be making money tomorrow. So we disagree. It's an opinion. My opinion is different, but we can see. Do you think the Keystone pipeline should go ahead, and is it a viable deal taken long view and all the costs included, or you take the shorter view that just bite the bullet for another hour or two till we get some more of these alternative energies in fact take some of the money and fund it, we might be better off. Yeah, small bear, angry bear, this again, Ottawa. You recall Trudeau was going to tax small business. They thought they were sort of a ploy for small businesses were a way to hire families and one thing or another, which there is some of that in there, but said it wasn't fair, therefore we're going to close down all these loopholes and tax considerations for small business. And of course that is just raised up in anger a whole new community, a whole new association on the idea of wages and tax costs and regulations are just too much in Canada, and they want less of it, not more. And I think you're going to see if Trump gets successfully passed, and there was talk today that he may be successful in getting his new tax code and tax plan in place, as well as complete rescindment of the Obama healthcare system, all in before Christmas. It's going to explode down there economically, and it's going to put pressure on our federal and provincial governments to get their taxes in line with our folks just south of the border. They just can't, say, gerrymander the from point A to point B, just in we saw there a few minutes ago on the taxes, give with one hand and take back with the other. That's just wasting everybody's time and more confusion for accountants and you and I trying to make our income tax out. Yeah, a couple of pages of employees' view on online education, and basically it's growing, it's being well accepted, and employers increasingly don't see any difference. In fact, I was on a national panel with a couple of vice presidents, HR, and I asked them, what do you look for in our MBAs for hiring? And he says, Terry, we just check the box, you got an MBA. It's not a make-weight, it's just you got one, you got one. And this is from some, Oxford, Yale, Harvard, Wharton. Clearly, and in Canada we have Queens. If you got something like that stamp, that might do it for you, Western. But other than that, an MBA from whatever organization, an MBA, what they're looking for, they said two things. We want to make sure that your culture, your individual culture, aligns closely to the company's culture. The closer that alignment, then the less policies we need, and the happier you'll be, the happier you'll be. So they try to probe to get some sense of your culture, your values, and those sort of things. And Facebook today makes that pretty easy for them. And the other side of it is, what sort of a team player are you? Is there evidence that you can play well on a team? And both those skills we promote here in this particular course and here at the school. But that's what they're looking for, as I understand it. There's some HR folks in the classroom today, professionals. And so maybe I can defer to you and ask you to jump a thread in there and tell me, do you think team building and values, culture, corporate culture, and your own culture, your own values, the company values, the closer the alignment, is that what you're looking for? Or what else do you look for when you hire people? It'd be nice to share. And lots of it online going through it. Central bankers are issuing guides. Keep in mind we talked in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy. Two levers to stake and control the economic engine. Fiscal policy is your finance minister with the budgets and things they put out. And the monetary policy is going down the basement, printing interest, printing money, watching inflation, and setting bank rates up and down to try to control the inflation. And so we have the federal banks coming together like a fist. The U.S., the European, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan are all working together collectively to give us some guidelines of what's out in front of us, because there are some serious bumps coming our way. And they said at least we don't mind, as one of our monetary tools, if you will, is actually to tell you to foreshadow, to give up front that we're contemplating, subject to anything happening, the rates are going to go up a quarter point in 3 months' time. And that gives business a time to adjust, to tweak, and make it happen. Well, I think we're just about there. Oh, yeah, I wonder that this is too. General Electric, long time, the stock, blue chip, American, it was America, and it is crashing. I've got a chart here that from the years 2007 to the years 2017, over a 10-year span, Apple leads the pack. It has got a total return of 699%, 700% return in those 10 years. General Electric is minus 30%, and it goes for all the other companies up and down. But General Electric's lost its way. It's that crafting strategy we do in this course, repositioning, not seeing this new industrial age on that area. They say they want to prune the rosebush, chuck things over the side, focus now on power, aviation, and healthcare equipment. And those scream out, don't they, from your papers, this Internet of Everything, this new innovations, new technology. And then I ask you, can you think of any GE new technology R&D spending on this? I can't. It's all done by new upstarts. It's done by Musk. It's done by Apple. I can't think of anything General Motors have been doing in the healthcare of any significance of late. And so they're really starting out behind the 8 ball, and the shares have plummeted down. Not fair to the shareholders. And the question right now is, they're going to have to start firing some real money at research and development to close the gap again, or else we may see it balkanize and go. As we said, you got to run paranoid. Just because you're GE, you got to run paranoid. The upstarts behind you are going to eat your cake, and that's what we see here. So, strategists, let's watch that. I think that's enough for today, folks. It's been a good chat. You add anything you want to add. You've got topics, put them up there you want to chat about. I enjoy the exercise. Folks, hope you're having fun. We'll see you. Bye-bye now.